Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched, where this week I watched Black Swan from 2010. Now, this is sort of the last in the series. Well, I shouldn't say last. I dabble in the horror genre, no matter the time of year, but this was sort of the last one I had in mind for the spooky season, as I continue to call it. And I am really glad I finally got around to watching this movie. This has been on my list for a long time, like so many others, but it's one of those ones that I have put off because of a perception that it is very emotionally intense and something I wasn't sure I was ready for a lot of the time. I am, to be direct about it, very, very pleased with this film. I think it is a fantastic film, a fantastic horror movie, and hits on a lot of elements that I think more horror should take notes from. It definitely has elements that I don't particularly like in horror, but I mean that in this case in the way of it's things that make me uncomfortable, not things that I think are bad cinematically or something like that. And I think it uses them judiciously enough that I don't feel like they're being used in an exploitative or manipulative way towards the audience. This is a great story with a lot of great elements about the production that I think lead to something that's a lot more than the sum of its parts and does a lot with a little. This is a very small story by all accounts. A very insular story about a few individuals in a small group and how a very intense life kind of takes people over. And it's definitely one I'm going to end up watching multiple times because while I don't think it's massively complicated narratively, I think there's a lot of nuance to be taken in, both on first watching and probably on repeated watchings as well. This is a movie I've seen both put on given very high praise for being incredible, and other people have criticized dramatically for a variety of reasons over the years. And I took a lot of that with a grain of salt, as I usually do, and having not seen it, didn't take a lot of it into direct account. But especially after watching it now, I think a lot of the detractors probably don't understand what this movie was about or what its intention was. And the two movies I think that I had in mind while I was watching it to compare it to were Whiplash, which I believe we also watched on this show, and then Perfect Blue, which there's some narrative parallels there, but is a very different kind of movie. And the first one I want to compare it to is Whiplash, because to me this runs in a very similar vein of people assuming that it's about a certain intense artistic thing, and it's not. I swear I should have double checked before I started recording this, but the thing about Whiplash and about this movie as well is that the context is for setting pretty much only. It is very integral to the story that's being told, but the actual narrative, the subtext, all of the important, interesting information that's going on in the film is about character and about humanity, not about the situation. So while I've seen people talk about Whiplash of that's not how jazz conservatories are, of course it isn't. That wasn't the point. And the same thing about this movie. That's not how ballet is. And no, it isn't, because that wasn't the point. The point isn't to paint a realistic story about the reality of a particular niche art form. The point is to tell a story about individuals and their relationships to each other. Now, the two movies definitely start to differ when you get any deeper than that, because Whiplash is very much about strong character, and it's ultimately a character study about the relationship between individuals and the things that they can or are willing to do to each other. This movie relies much more on metaphor and subtext to sort of understand what it's really saying about the individuals on screen. This is not so much about the individuals as characters as they are manifestations of human patterns, let's say. So one of the things I find most interesting, and I'm going to get a little bit into the sort of the content of the film. I'm not going to spoil plot beats, but I sort of front loaded this video because I wanted to say, I think it's really good. And if you really want to watch it, then maybe skip this section or come back to it after you've watched it. But I'm not going to spoil plot beats, just sort of talk a lot about the tone and context. And so one of the things I find most interesting is the way this movie unpacks life experience that is not on screen, that you get only through context clues, basically. And that's not to say that it's particularly subtle or trying to hide what it's trying to say, but it is subtle enough or not relatable enough to some people that I think a lot of people, from my perception of other people's talking about this movie, is they don't recognize what it's trying to say. This is a movie mostly about abuse. It's about how, to my reading, it's about how a lifetime of being set up for a particular goal, a particular path in your life, having people who tell you what to do and try and control you, is deeply damaging to a person. And how even if you can get away from the type of people who harmed you or, controlled you, did all these things early in your life, those things travel with you throughout your general life until you deal with them. And even then, they never truly go away. But when you live a life under people who manipulate, control, abuse you, it sets a person up to have that happen to them again. Not through any fault of their own or intention, but if you live an entire childhood up to adulthood being conditioned to react certain ways for survival purposes or whatever, that will then show up in adulthood as well. And that shows very, very clearly in the main character played by Natalie Portman. She's very clearly a character who has suffered in her family life and has come has ended up as a dancer because of a lot of pressure on her, both directly about ballet and not about ballet. And as a sidebar, I actually know a number of different ballet dancers. It's weird to think back on this because it's not even something I necessarily think about very much or recognize, but I know several or have known several ballet dancers, including ones who have done Swan Lake before. And they are very intense people. Now, it's not necessarily their whole personality. It depends on what level they're to. I've known some that were professional, some that were like, a little less professional, and some that were like one that was a very big name. And there's definitely a trend, but you have to be a little bit crazy to do ballet. I'm just going to put that out there. I don't think any self-aware ballet dancer would ever look at what they do and say, nah, this isn't crazy. No, it's very intense. It's intense to the level that if you take it very seriously and consider it as a profession at all, you are, you're at the peak of a very, very niche art that requires intense study, focus, practice, regimenting your much of your life around that. And so there is something about inherently about the nature of ballet that makes it fall naturally into this kind of story. That's not to say that I think this is, reality or a common kind of thing, but it does line up very well with a lot of sort of the psychological and general life physical conditioning as well that goes into becoming somebody like that, becoming a prima ballerina. So I think if you don't have any of the context for ballet and you don't have any of the context for the psychology, I could understand why you might watch this film and not get it, or think that it's just, trying to be scary at this, that, and the other place, or horrific at this, that, and the other place. But this was a deeply difficult movie for me to watch at some times, because certain elements of it were very familiar to me personally. Not because I've done ballet or anything like that, but there are elements in this that are a familiar sort of thing. Intense people who are very demanding and push you in ways that are not fair, and you just have to deal with them. The ways that abuse and psychological manipulation change your behavior, even when you're not with the people who have done those things to you, the way that it messes with your mind and even makes you think things that aren't true. And I think that's a common enough sentiment, in a general psychological context, that a lot of people, especially in our current climate of being more accepting of psychosis and understanding mental health, can be a little bit familiar with the understanding that your mind is a fragile thing, and that you sometimes do or see or hear or understand things in a way that is not objective, because the things that you have experienced in your past shape how you view your present and your future. And that's what I think is so interesting and intense about this movie, because you can look at certain scenes and see the way that Portman's character is suffering, and the things that she's doing to herself, and the things that she sees in the world or understands about the world. And the movie does a great job of sort of flipping between, with sort of very seamlessly, without ever, explaining, flipping between a perception that's within her own head and one that's outside of it. There are enough kind of gentle perspective breaks where you suddenly realize you're not in her perspective, that you are in a more general, third person looking on. You're getting more reaction shots from other characters, all these other things, to understand that, oh no, this is her exhibiting this behavior in a way that other people now are seeing and are finding alarming, versus she's looking out from her own head, from her own psychosis, and understanding her world in a way that is not entirely accurate because of her own anxieties, her own history, and her own drive. So much of this is sort of a story of a lot of it is self-inflicted, but it is that self-inflicted harm is contextual to all of what she has undergone before. She has to, she's not aware of her own perception beyond what ends up being sort of the more horrific, more supernatural elements. And that's another sort of point where the movie pivots from perspectives, where there are the elements that seem to be more like her genuinely misidentifying a situation, or viewing something that isn't real, that might actually, in world be a sort of a hallucination for her, versus things that blur towards the more metaphorical, that they are not, they may be in her head, but they're not what she's actually seeing. They are a metaphor for the viewer, the viewer of the movie, to understand how warped her perception is, to understand like the kind of vision, the kind of subjectivity that she's concocted to validate the feelings, the intense emotional distress that she's already experiencing. And there's just so many like brilliant little things about that work so well towards forming this sort of whole multifaceted perspective of an individual in a very unique situation who has undergone a lot and is processing very poorly a situation that is too much for her, basically. And she has basically no one in her life who is helping her to process that in a healthy way. She has no one to reach out to. She has no one to confide in, because her life up to that point is so insular, so focused on these few things that she has, that a combination of her own self-isolation as well as isolation that has been caused by other people's treatment of her has put her in this very, very intense, very emotional, very disturbing situation at many different times. I love the way the movie wraps itself together as well. I think that the movie could have ended or told its last few steps a lot of different ways, and I can see why some people might be unsatisfied with the ending, but I think it's kind of brilliantly left open in a way that is it's left open, but not in a way that is unsatisfying. It's pretty conclusive, and it's almost a positive in the end. There's a sense of finality to it, and a sense of hopefulness to it, but also one that is like deeply distressing at the same time. And I think that's really, really interesting. They could have dragged the movie out for another 20 minutes or something like that and tried to tell some sort of epilogue, and I think that would have been a grave mistake. So I love the way the movie ends off. So that's sort of my general thoughts. I maybe shouldn't have skipped all of... I just wanted to talk about this movie a lot because I really, really like it. As far as the productions, because the production that went on here, let's talk about the casting first. Natalie Portman as the main is fantastic in her role. I do think... I can't remember if I've talked about her before. I feel like she's come up in some other movie before, but I don't think she's got the greatest range as an actor, but I think that this movie really lets her flex her physical and emotional acting. That's both to say that like she had some training prior as a ballerina, and did additional training for this movie, and her performance there, I understand it's sometimes it's a stand-in as well, but she did some very intense training for it as well, and her physical acting and the dancing is excellent. Her acting in all the other scenes is also really excellent. The looks of emotions on her face are expressed with great intensity that doesn't, it never skirts into being cheesy, but really accomplishes showing intense anguish, confusion, all these kind of things going on. And for 2010 as well, my understanding is this was sort of her my memory is that this was sort of her breakout back out of the roles that she had been cast in historically, especially after stuff like Star Wars, and so being taken as a more serious actor as well, a lot of acclaim there, and I think she got some awards for this movie in that regard. I also think that Mila Kunis, who sort of plays her foil of sorts, is fantastic as well. I believe they were sort of friends before and helped each other get the roles here in some form. But she also did a lot of training for the ballet, and they both, did very, very well in the dancing portion, and in sort of having an intense relationship with each other in a variety of different ways. I think they do a great job together on screen of showing the variations between what the reality is between these two individuals, their level of camaraderie, friendship, whatever else, as well as like a varying distance, because there is this warped perception of Natalie's character, Nina. Yeah, that's the name. Nina's perception is very warped, and so scene to scene, there can be a lot of variability, a lot of inconsistency even. And I think through a combination of the performances and the directing and editing, they do a great job of showing this this perception of Lily. Mila Kunis's character is Lily, who she has this variability that in a different movie, if you misunderstood this movie to be about like everybody being manipulative rather than the perception of the viewer or of the main character being warped, you would say, oh well, the character is very inconsistent. But this is more of a no, the inconsistency is in the viewer's eyes. It is the perception of somebody who varies from scene to scene between being viewed as a colleague, a friend, a villain, whatever, and the performance is excellent on both sides of that to show sort of that variability and the emotional roller coaster that causes for both characters, because it's also weird for Lily, even just seeing this person she knows go through these different perceptions of her. All of the other characters I think are really well cast. Vincent Cassel is usually very good in things I've seen him in. He's a real weirdo in this, as he often is in a lot of the things he's cast in. He does very well. Winona Ryder is kind of in a limited role, but I really like her. There's a couple of scenes she's in. She's very intense. Great performance there. And then I have to say Ksenia Solo, who I recognize from other things, she kind of plays herself, but I love her as sort of this contrasting character to some of the other people present, but she also puts on a lot of intensity that I really appreciate. Everybody else on the cast, really no complaints, great performances all around. This is a fairly low budget film by all accounts. I think the number quoted is like 13 million, which it is limited in scope, but it has some relatively big names attached to it, obviously. And Darren Aronofsky, as the director, was not at this time, nor now is a small director either. So this is a very focused production. But they do a lot with the money they had, clearly, because they didn't cheap out on the actors or the trainings or the production values. This may be limited to a lot of like homes and streets and then stage, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot that goes into that. And so they make great use of sets. I believe most of it is like all just real locations, which is totally understandable. So they don't have to build a lot of a whole stage, that sort of thing. But the costuming is fantastic. The makeup work, it doesn't have to be that flashy, but like it's just right for the type of thing that's being put on ballet dancers. There are a lot of like great all of the extras as well, who are presumably professional dancers in one form or another, do an excellent job. And then all of the costuming all around is very, very good. There's also not non-traditional makeup. There's practical effects that are used in a variety of scenes that are done very, very well. And then to augment all of that, they use some judicious use of some CGI effects that I think are used to, again, very good effect. They're used carefully. They're not used too extensively. They're not the best looking thing ever, but they're used in the right places for the right reasons to give the sort of supernatural feeling of somebody's warped perception, that it works super, super well. And I love some of the scenes they used it for. Lots of the sort of there's lots of like digital compositing stuff. There's no like big crazy Hollywood-esque CGI stuff, but the digital compositing done over shot footage to add little touches or to add a more spectacular effect in a few cases is really, really good, and is it's such a great reminder of this warped perception that is going on in the head of Nina. I love the work they did with it. Like I said, it's not perfect, but like it looks very good, and I think it adds very well to it. That covers a lot of the production stuff. Like I said, I think the story is fairly, like, the story is not that subtle. It's not that complicated. It's not asking you to dig really deep into subtext. A lot of what it's trying to say is like right on the surface of the subtext. It's not textual, but it's contextual. Understanding the things I was talking about the emotional history of the character and all the people around her, as well as the whole situation they are in as dancers, and as the familial and friendship, familiar relationships and friendships that are present as well. Like, that is all really, really well balanced. So it doesn't need a really crazy, convoluted, manipulative like story that's trying to hide anything from you, because it has so much nuance built into it in context. Most of the music is just from Swan Lake, and it is, I think, expertly mixed. It is used to very good effect in the moments when it needs to be. Sometimes it's just doing the production, and sometimes it's mixed more intensely for the context of the emotion of a scene, and similarly to Whiplash, it's sort of using the diegetic music it manipulates diegetic music in non-diegetic or manipulates it in ways that are not about the reality of the scene to intensify the emotions of a scene. I think they do a really good job there. It's very judicious. Again, This is an effort in doing a lot without doing too much. It's just a really solid production all around. I'm super impressed. Like I mentioned, it's Darren Aronofsky as the director. I have watched a couple of his films. Almost every single one of his, I think with the exception of like maybe two of his films, every one of his films that I haven't watched already is also on my list, with one or two exceptions, I think. But he makes some pretty intense stuff. Requiem for a Dream is a movie that will haunt me for my entire life, because guy knows what he's doing. And there are some cinematic elements that I don't always love as the viewer, but some of them are very personal to me. This whole movie the cinematography is generally very good. Things like the framing and the sense of the emotional perception of spaces is really important, and I think was captured really well. It seems to be deliberate to me especially to make a lot of spaces feel exaggerated in their smallness or largeness. So there's a lot of shots that are really expertly composed to give a sense of loneliness or a sense of being sort of out of place, or in a sense of confinement on the other side of that. The one thing I don't particularly like is there is a lot of handy cam footage of this film, and while I don't have a great idea of how better to shoot some elements, I understand why they did it. There's a lot of sort of what's been coined as shaky cam, and I think that is reflective of the very turbulent emotional state that is going through Nina the entire movie. But at some point it becomes for me personally, too taxing on my eyes. I need a little bit more stability. I don't know if that means just toning down how shaky the footage is sometimes, or just choosing to use it more judiciously only on certain shots. It just became too intense, and by the very end my eyes were kind of fatigued by that. But that's mostly sort of a personal preference. It doesn't ultimately ruin the cinematography of the film at all, or undo any of the other compliments I gave to it. So I think it's very, very solid. I also want to compare this to, I may watch some of Aronofsky's other films on this show, we'll see. But I'm just so pleased with this film, and I can certainly understand why it got so many accolades, and frankly, I think it should get more. I don't hear a lot of people talk about this movie now, but I think it's probably one of my favorite horror films overall. I think it captures the things that I love about horror, the opportunity to show the fragility of the human mind, and the way that people can be hurt and manipulated and broken and healed as well through the experiences that they have, and you don't need to resort to like really crazy stuff. Oh, one other thing, I sort of mentioned it, but there are certain moments in this film that were grotesque to the point of like I had to look away because it bothered me too much. But compared to some other films where I've complained about that, none of these were excessive. They were very much just like, this is extremely intense and hard to watch, and that is it felt personal to me, because I've had, for some of those things, I've had moments of understanding that emotional turmoil of, man, this is so emotionally intense, and like there's, whether it's a body horror thing, a nervous tick or something like that, or just like realizing that you are in a human body, and that's kind of disturbing sometimes, understanding how a living in meat goes. I never blamed it for that. I just had to look away a little bit because it was so intense. So I don't really like it, but it's very, very good. Anyway, I think that's my last sort of side note that I've forgotten here, but I think this movie is fantastic. If you've seen it, please by all means leave a comment and let me know your thoughts, whether you liked it or not, or if there were elements that you didn't pick up on or I didn't pick up on. So as always, let me know. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched, and I'll see you guys next time.